Good evening, everyone. Ooh, that's loud. Um, Thank you for being here with us this evening. I am Susie Acord. I am the development manager here at Schoodic Institute. I want to thank you guys for coming out this evening and being part of our summer lecture series. The series is made possible through our generous sponsor, Bar Harbor Bank and Trust, and also because of support from generous donors like all of you guys. So I hope everybody enjoyed the reception that we just had. Got some claps. Yeah, that was very nice. A little different than what we normally do, but we love that Margie is able to be here with us this evening and sharing her art and her stories with us. So if you are new to Schoodic Institute, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are the Acadia National Park's primary partner in science and education, and we are one of 17 research learning centers across the national park system. And we are the only one that is led by a nonprofit partner. And so we are helping resource managers in the park advance and advance the science and solutions to rapid change in Acadia and beyond. And so I just wanted to share a little bit more. For those of you that were here at the reception, we heard a little bit from Margie and her background, but we have many friends on Zoom. So I just wanted to share some more about Margie before she presents. She is a science writer, memoirist, and photographer. Her memoir, More Than Meets the Eye, Exploring Nature and Loss on the Coast of Maine, was given the Outstanding Book Award by the American Society for Journalists and Authors in 2022. Best-selling author Cy Montgomery called it beautiful and surprising. A beautiful and surprising book in which bereavement gives way to awe. Her photo book, Wild and Wondrous, Nature's Artistry on the Coast of Maine, which was published in July of 2023, is not just a book, but a stunning work of art that transports the reader to the magical shores of Maine. This is coming from award-winning nature photographer Stephen Mendel, who said that about her work. Patlak's personal essays and articles have appeared in a number of newspapers, magazines, and literary journals, including the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Post, Discover Magazine, Hippocampus, Juxtaprose, and many others. Her photographs have appeared in solo and group exhibits in Maine and are in private collections. She has degrees in botany, environmental studies, and divides her time between Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Korea, Maine. I know that I've been really excited to hear the presentation that's happening tonight since last year. So Margie and I first began a conversation about doing this presentation during our summer lecture series last year. And Margie, thank you again for displaying your photographs and bringing books this evening. And we're just really thankful that you're here and looking forward to hearing what you say.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Susie. And I have to say that it's really strange for me to be up here at the podium after spending so many years in the audience. I've come to almost every educational program that the Schoodic Institute has offered for many years, and I'm usually the only one in the audience that's busy scribbling notes constantly. But it paid off because a lot of the information that I got from these sorts of presentations, I ended up incorporating in my book, More Than Meets the Eye. So thank you to the Schoodic Institute for doing such wonderful educational programming, and it's an honor to be part of it tonight. So you can see from the title here that I'm going to share with you nature's lessons on life, loss, legacy, and restorative wonder. And I'll also showcase some of the more wondrous scenery that we have in Maine as I give my talk. But first, I'm going to tell you how I came to learn those lessons and write my memoir, More Than Meets the Eye, which became much more than I originally thought it would be. So I started, oh, and then I should mention too that before getting into that, I'll illustrate the talk mostly with my photos, but there'll be a handful that I got from the uh, um, uh, public domain, and those will be indicated on the slides. And then at the end of my talk, we'll have plenty of time to have a question and answer session, which I look forward to. So, how did a gal from Philadelphia end up writing about the nature on the coast of Maine rather than the nature on the coast of New Jersey? Uh, well, I started um, writing More Than Meets the Eye when my husband Frank and I got our place on the Scudic Peninsula, right on the bay, surrounded by a forest, like you can see there. And that was after we spent decades progressing, like most people who own a summer home in Maine do, which is to go from tenting to renting to buying. And what brought us to Maine in the first place was really my fault. I had so many fond childhood memories of spending summers on Mount Desert Island while my father worked at the Mount Desert Island Biology Lab. He did research there. So even though I was raised in a suburb of DC and I raised my family in a suburb of Philadelphia, I always yearned for the wilder environment that I experienced in Maine. So first of all, I wanted a beach that was rocky, not sandy. And I wanted there to be forests and mountains nearby that were filled with, wild creatures that would pop out and surprise you. And I wanted to swim in the expansiveness of the bay and not be limited to the lap lane of a pool. So I don't know if you can make that out, but this is a drone photo taken by Brett Binns. Is that red arrow is pointing to me swimming in the Gouldsboro Bay. And believe it or not, I stay in there for a good half hour to 45 minutes. Um, it's wonderful. People say it's freezing. I say it's refreshing. Um, but I always miss the beautiful, awe-inspiring scenery in Maine. So I was thrilled when we finally bought our home that is surrounded, like I said, by acres of forest. And I was really eager to learn more about my new digs. I've always been kind of perpetually curious, so I had lots of questions when we started spending summers and then eventually parts of each shoulder season up at our place in Maine. So, people kept telling me that there were these moose around, but I never saw them. And how come I can't see something that's so big, I wonder? And then why were we getting these big puffy clouds all the time that were dark, but they never rained on us? And how do the animals survive the winter in here? So anyhow, my way of learning something is to research and write about it. It's what I did for 30 years as a science writer. So I started to research and write about everything I was encountering. So, for example, I wrote about the pea-drenched foreplay of the moose, which is pretty exciting, actually, and the awesome jumps that fox make when they go after their prey. And I wrote about why the porcupine is overpopulated on the Scudic Peninsula and a bane to gardeners, although this one looks pretty cute, I have to say. And I also wrote about, the geological forces that thrust up the mountains in Maine and striped our Scudic Peninsula with these black basalt dikes that you can see up there on the left, upper left. And I wrote about the dramatic clouds and weather and tides that we have. And actually, all of these photos were taken at Scudic Acadia, so maybe you recognize the scenery. Anyhow, while I was doing this writing, I realized something peculiar was happening, and that was that I kept on um, incorporating my family into what I was writing about. So, my brother, my parents, my grandparents, even my great grandparents and my kids would surface. So, for example, I'd be writing about the 3 generations of monarch butterflies that it takes to make their way from their wintering grounds in Mexico to their summering grounds in Maine. And then that would morph into me writing about the migrations that my own family did over the generations. Or I'd be writing about the dramatic 13-foot tides that we have and how they shape our daily activity. And that would change into me writing about the fleeting nature of time and the special ephemeral nature of raising a child. So I didn't really understand why I was doing this exactly, and until I was back in Philadelphia in the winter, and I was part of a writers group there, and the leader of the writers group said, "Why don't you take what you've written about Maine and turn it into a book? And to get a better sense of what that book is about, why don't you write the introduction?" So I did that, and that introduction, which I'm going to read to you now, became the prologue of my book, and it totally surprised me. And I think you'll see why in a minute when I read it to you. The seals swim out to meet my mother. We are gathered on the weathered gray dock of a rented Maine house. Sunlight glints on the water, and a cool breeze wafts the distinctive aroma of the rocky coast, a pungent combination of the earthy spiciness of fir, pine, and spruce trees, and the fishy smells of seaweed, mussels, and cobbles soaked in brine. Although my mother grew up in an apartment building in Chicago and lived most of her life tied to the asphalt of various cities, she always loved the summers we spent on the sparsely populated Mount Desert Island in Maine. She took us blueberry picking on the boulder-strewn hill near the lab, frog hunting at the local pond, and clam digging on the bay at low tide. My mom loved looking out at all the beauty by the water, the bay framed by wind-sculpted silhouettes of trees like those in Japanese paintings, the gossamer fog at sunrise, the rosy hues of the sky reflected in the water as the sun sank. So we thought it only appropriate to scatter my mother's remains in the Gulf of Maine. Overshadowed by the looming mountains behind us, our family huddles on the creaking wooden platform, dwarfed by the backdrop of the expansive blue bay. Both my balding brother and elderly father rest heavily on their canes. My oldest child, Jake, and my brother's oldest son, Johann, both gangly, slip into kayaks tethered to the dock. After we untie their ropes and give each son a paddle, my brother's wife hands Johann the small cardboard box of ashes, and he plies the glassy water, Jake paddling his kayak in parallel. My husband, Frank, puts his arm around my slumped shoulders, and we watch as my mother's grandsons, boys that had become men while she entered her final years, put away their paddles and together shake out flecks of her bone and ash. How could my mother, with her caramel eyes that reflected delight in my every achievement and angry outbursts that made me cower in my bedroom, be reduced to that small package of dust? While the gray powder falls into the water, it sinks in that I am truly a motherless child. But I wrestle with that biblical notion of ashes to ashes. Surely something remains. While the last bits of my mother slip into the sea, a few curious seals swim over to see what is falling into their waters. A beautiful swirling dance ensues as their swimming heads engrave the calm water with V's that eventually merge with the kayak's wakes. It is entrancing, and though I do not feel my mother is embodied in her ashes, there is something comforting about her being welcomed by these tidal dwellers and returned to Maine and the primordial sea. 2 years later, it is the ash remains of my brother's 55-year-old body that are spread on a mountain in Vermont. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, also called ALS, the week my mom died. Just a few months after we gathered in Maine, my brother became confined to a wheelchair and quickly lost the ability to move most of his body. From the moment my mother was diagnosed with metastatic cancer to the time my father died 10 years later, death lapped up the edges of my family like an incoming tide that quickly submerges the small islands it encounters. Propelled in part by my brother's death and a deepened awareness that life can be short, Frank and I decided to make the most of our remaining lives. We took the plunge and used proceeds from the sale of Frank's business in Philadelphia to buy a 5-acre slice of a northern Maine forest and bay with the cedar, mahogany, and glass Frank Lloyd Wrightish house my mother would have loved. We started spending summers there, and after our daughter went off to college, falls as well. Frank always had that business instinct of buying low and selling high and saw having a house on the coast of Maine as a good investment. I saw it as an emotional lifesaver. Now, that last sentence totally shocked me. And, you know, here I thought I was writing about just writing about the nature in Maine, but then I realized I'm also writing about what the nature in Maine is teaching me about the nature of life and what remains once the ashes are spread. And by asking that question, I was venturing into spiritual or philosophical territory that no amount of scientific research was going to answer, right? So it was at that point that I decided to view and write everything I was experiencing in Maine with both a spiritual and a scientific lens. And it was also at that point that I decided to publish what I had written because I felt like other people who were experiencing a loss of some sort might also benefit from what I was learning. Um, so now let's go sample those life lessons. All right, lesson number one, life isn't always just and nature is indifferent to our fate. This can be a hard lesson to learn, but it's one that nature teaches us all the time. But many of us get angry when they lose a loved one, especially if it's someone who is a young person who hasn't had a chance to live out their full life, because they feel like it's unjust. But I've even seen that anger coming from a woman who she was mad at God because he let her husband die, but he was well into his 80s when he died. So I think that really speaks to our death denying culture and our inability to accept death as part of the natural cycle of life. Um, as a mortician, Caitlin Doughty noted, death is the most natural thing in the world, and treating it as deviant isn't doing our culture any favors. We don't control nature. We aren't higher ranking than nature. And what brought this home personally was not only having my brother die prematurely from ALS, but a kayaking expedition in our little community in Korea. That's Korea spelt with the C. That's right here on the Skud Peninsula for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's a small town, fishing village where everybody knows everybody. And this kayaking venture was led by Ed, a man on our peninsula who had a family business that rents out kayaks and takes people on guided kayak rides on the bay. Some of you may remember Ed here who are here. And here's what I wrote about that deadly expedition in my book. Ed had taken two New Jersey tourists on a guided kayak ride in the Korea Bay one beautiful blue sky June afternoon. They put in their kayaks at the same beach I had been to at least 100 times, admiring its beautiful fireweed frame view of the water, speckled by small teardrop-shaped islands of rounded rock topped by evergreens. The same beach I enjoyed visiting at high tide when the waves tumble together cobbles on the upper shore so that they clatter like 1,000 castanets. And Ed and the New Jersey couple experienced the same unexpected squall that seemingly crept out of nowhere and caused many of us on land to run for cover. As experienced a kayaker as Ed was, he and the couple were unable to escape the dangerous combination of wind and water that swept them out into the open ocean. There they were swamped by 5-foot waves that capsized their kayaks in 52-degree water. Only one of the three was discovered alive that night by a lobsterman who was part of the search crew sent out when they didn't return on time. Draped over her kayak, her wrist wrapped around a cord attached to it, she was hypothermic, having fallen into unconsciousness, while both Ed and her husband died from cold exposure. All three were wearing life jackets. Usually you chalk up the deaths of boaters, hikers, or other outdoor explorers to inexperience or the lack of proper equipment or insufficient caution. But when we first bought our kayaks, Ed was the one who offered lessons on how to recover after capsizing and other sea kayaking tips. He was the one stressing the dangers of the sea and making sure you prepare for them. He was the one who, during his 30+ years as a guide, probably had taken close to 1,000 people safely through the waters of Korea's Bay. If anyone knew what to do during a squall, it would have been him. Yet even he wasn't able to survive the fury unleashed by a passing storm, a conglomeration of clouds. Nature is not always benevolent. Knowing that, already cognizant of calamities caused by hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes, I always found it amusing when people were horrified by internet footage revealing fratricides among nesting birds. Such videos punctured their view of nature as warm and fuzzy. But I once saw a snake swallow a frog alive. Alive. The snake had snatched the frog by its hind legs and held it tight as the animal lurched frantically to escape death. Then, as the snake's jaws slowly opened wider during a span of about 5 minutes, they gradually engulfed the frog, its bulging eyes the last to be swallowed. I felt sorry for the frog, but I also empathized with the hungry snake. After the kayaking tragedy in our own neighborhood, I recalled the explanation given to the ancient Hebrews for why their temple was destroyed and they were unfairly exiled. God had turned away from them. How could God be so cruel? I wondered. Then I remembered my brother's explanation for why ALS was about to cut his life short at the age of 55. Shit happens. Although it follows some predictable rules, weather is not just, cannot be controlled, and can still rise unexpectedly or be ignored at our own peril. I don't believe God is resting on top of the clouds, dictating where the rain will fall, the lightning will strike, or the length of a brother's life. But I do recognize that there are forces out there bigger than we are, bigger than all of humanity, forces that take away all illusions of control. Akin to Joni Mitchell, I have looked at clouds from both sides now, seen both their beauty and their brutality, their rules and their irregularities, their yin and their yang, and yet still choose clouds over the empty void. So that last line refers to the fact that our livable atmosphere on Earth is thought to be rare in our solar system, if not our universe. This was something that the first astronauts were struck by, and this photo they took of Earth supposedly changed their spiritual outlook, and it certainly changed mine. Um, so part of this lesson that I learned about nature and not being just is that it's still better than the alternative, right? I mean, life on our planet is a wonder that I try to never take for granted. And I realize that my own minuscule life on this earth comes with both pain and pleasure, but it's better than the alternative, which is never experiencing either. So here's an excerpt from my book that encapsulates this. My favorite sweatshirt has an arrow pointing to a star, our sun in the Milky Way, with the caption, "You are here." Yes, we are here at this unique moment in time, I remind myself when checking out at the grocery store and looking around at all the people waiting beside me. Crying babies, tattooed mothers, men with beards covering their chests, and gray-haired grandmothers missing teeth. This disparate family of humanity is whom I share my world with. 100 years earlier, none of us was born, and 100 years later, none of us will still be around. Like an alien who has just landed on our planet, we should be looking around in amazement, rejoicing at what we see before us, in awe of this colorful and vibrant alternative to the void, the dark womb we left behind, the black tomb we'll eventually enter, the vast and sterile emptiness of outer space. Okay, now we're moving on to lesson number 2, which is there's a limit to what we can accomplish in this lifetime, but the possibilities are endless when we see ourselves as part of a continuum. And I actually learned this lesson from a monarch butterfly. One summer, I plucked one from the butterfly weed growing in my garden, and I put it in a jar so I could see it transform into that wonderful green chrysalis that you see in the center with the gold necklace. And then a couple weeks later, it looked like what you see on the right there. It got to be translucent, and you could see the wing of the monarch as almost looked like a pentimento. And then, of course, once came out, it had to dry its wings, so it posed very nicely for me. Um, but I think what was even more amazing was what I learned about the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. So with that as a background, I'm going to read a section from my book that talks about this and I think encapsulates this lesson number 2. It takes 3 to 4 generations to make the monarch's more than 2,000-mile journey from where it overwinters in Mexico to where it summers in Maine. Each butterfly lives about 2 months and travels only part of the way before laying eggs on butterfly weed and other milkweed species. These eggs enable the next generation of butterflies to carry on the trek north. Presumably, it does this because there are more food opportunities as it heads up to Canada. In the fall, the last generation to emerge from their chrysalises makes the entire return journey south to Mexico. This astonishing migration made me contemplate my own family's migration. My great-grandparents were Jews in Tsarist Russia who were restricted to villages known as shtetls. They left Russia to avoid having their 12-year-old sons conscripted into the army, their daughters raped during the carnage of pogroms. As a child, I overheard disturbing shards of stories about the old country, about my great grandmother hiding my grandmother when she was a baby in a dresser door during a pogrom, or my great grandfather hiding behind some trash cans to avoid being shot at. My great grandparents, like the monarchs heading north, hopscotched their way from Russia to Europe, eventually making the long voyage to America to find better opportunities for their family. They came with few possessions, one of which were the silver candlesticks they used to welcome the Sabbath into their homes every Friday night. On her deathbed, my mom insisted I take my great grandmother's candlesticks to my home. She also talked about how she wouldn't be able to finish all the books she wanted to read and suggested I read them instead. Once my mom died, the limits of her life, of all our lives, became apparent. Each of us carries out a mere step or two that moves our family forward in time. My great grandparents took a big leap coming to this country and then worked long hours as a tailor and homemaker so that their son could become a doctor and their daughter, my grandmother, could live a much more secure and comfortable life than the one she left behind in Russia. It's not just candlesticks that get passed from one generation to another. My mother handed off her gift of life with all its unfinished business and imperfections to me. And I will in turn hand off the same gift to my daughter, Eva. There's just so much each of us can accomplish in one lifetime. But the seemingly impossible becomes possible when all the generations are strung together, each of us playing a humble role in a magnificently evolving lifeline. The monarch knows this instinctively. Okay, lesson number 3. We are just specks in the universe, but by subsuming our egos, we can connect to a much larger sphere in space and time that gives us immortality in a different form. So I don't know if any of you experienced this, but when I first start to spend time on the bay in Maine, I find that my personal professional pushiness starts to subside and I start to take in what's around me, the sounds of the seals growling on the rocks or the sense of the sweet ferns and the conifers or the glitter of the Milky Way in the sky and the infinitude it suggests. Um, and with all the senses on high alert, pulling everything in sort of expands my horizons such that the trajectory of my own personal ambition loses force and direction. And my problems, I find, are diluted by the natural world that engulfs them. Similarly, the expansion you get by connecting to something greater than yourself can also be comforting as you near the end of your life. And one of the things that gave both my mother and I comfort as she was dying from cancer was this book by called Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch Albom, which is about conversations the author had with his former professor, Maurice Schwartz, who, like my brother, was suffering from ALS and aware that his life was about to end. So I'm going to read a brief passage from that book to you now. I heard a nice little story the other day, Maury says. The story is about a little wave bobbing along the ocean, having a grand old time. He's enjoying the wind and the fresh air until he notices the other waves in front of him crashing against the shore. My God, this is terrible, the wave says. Look what's going to happen to me. Then along comes another wave. It sees the first wave looking grim and it says to him, Why do you look so sad? The first wave says, You don't understand. We're all going to crash. All of us waves are going to be nothing. Isn't it terrible? The second wave says, No, you don't understand. We're not a wave. You're part of the ocean. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. I'm starting to lose my voice. And my own awareness that I'm a mere wave that's part of a vaster ocean actually got its start when I was 14 years old and spending a summer in Maine. And one night went out and looked at the sky and was amazed. So I'm going to share the portion of my book in which I describe this revelation. When I was 14, my typical adolescent problems dissolved upon seeing the night sky in Maine for the first time. Having grown up in the suburbs where endless streetlights obscured the stars, I always assumed there were only a handful of them. But one clear summer evening in Maine, I looked up expecting to detect the usual small grouping of stars and was astonished to see the sparkling cloud of the Milky Way stretched across the sky. Endless stars coalescing into the white filigree of our own galaxy like a rivulet of spilt milk flowing across the black hemisphere of night above. It was both humbling and expanding. Humbling in the sense of realizing my minute place in space, yet expansive in realizing that I was part of something much bigger than myself. Just as there was something freeing in seeing the last ashy remains of my mother become part of the vast ocean, I think it will in some way be liberating one day to be stardust again and scattered in the infinite cosmos. And the wildlife biologist and nature writer Bern Heinrich has something to say about this as well. Here's a quote from his book, Life Everlasting. I see the whole world as an organism with no truly separate parts. I want to be connected to the grandest, biggest, more real, and most beautiful thing in the universe as we know it, the life of Earth's nature. I want to join in the part of the greatest show on Earth, life everlasting. And the mortician Caitlin Dowdy adds, thinking about death moves you closer to magnanimity. You realize that you will have to give your body, your atoms and molecules, back to the universe when you're done with them. All right, lesson number 4. When we experience the rhythms, cycles, and spirals of nature, we experience eternity. So this lesson kind of overlaps with the previous one, and I learned it from the tides in Maine. And here are a few excerpts from my book that explain it. The powerful pull of the moon is especially apparent on the Maine shore, where it creates 13-foot tides that routinely fill and empty bays and determine daily rhythms of activity. The constantly changing tides in Maine dictate how I spend my time there. To go swimming or kayaking, I have to stop working at high tide. To collect sea glass or explore the islands, I need to close my computer at low tide. I try to match my rhythms of work and play with the ebb and flow of water that follows the moon. This way of marking time makes me more aware of time passing and the need to make the most of every moment. Yet I also recognize that the tides won't care whether I make it to the islands or to the celery-colored grasses of the marshes. They will come and go, spread out and suck in, keeping the planetary breathing rhythm, the endless time clock. For as the poet Mary Oliver noted, in water that departs forever and forever returns, we experience eternity. Nature will go on without me, which somehow is comforting. Then later in the book, I wrote, because the universe follows precise rules, physicists can predict the equivalent of the whole pie by just looking at a slice. From the circling of electrons and the spiraling of galaxies to the rhythms of menses and music, Our natural world conforms to a hidden higher order that occasionally gives us glimpses of its brilliant structural beauty. I find that higher order both inspiring and comforting. It is not merely ballast for loss, but a way to put everything in perspective. Instead of focusing on the empty spaces left by my brother and mother, the pauses between the notes, I'm able to see the melody, the sound waves formed by both crests and troughs, the joy that follows sorrow, and the sorrow that follows joy. The regular rhythm of waves pounding the shore as the tides ebb and flow, the endless cycles of life that connect me to a vastness of spirit. And one of my favorite stories about Maine related to this lesson comes from Louise Dickinson's Rich, her book, The Natural World of Louise Dickinson Rich. She used to spend her summers in Korea, Maine. And one summer, she had a city slicker friend who came to spend a month on the Scoot Peninsula because he had the hopes of relieving his health problems there. But after only a week, this friend is packing his bags, remarking, "The tide comes in and the tide goes out, and then it comes in and then it goes out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's all there is to it. Nothing else happens, and it doesn't accomplish a thing, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's driving me crazy. I've got to get away from it." But as I wrote in my book, too bad this gentleman never learned to appreciate the cyclical beauty of the tides, the ocean's rhythmic heartbeat that reassuringly marks time in the short term, while more subtly wearing down rocks to sandy beaches to be strolled on by later generations. He could have tuned into the ceaseless motion of our planet, which is the opposite of stagnation, and seen the long timelines of change that eventually turn a multitude of cycles into a spiral. It is the spiral that is the key to this world, whether it's embodied in our DNA or our Milky Way galaxy. A cycling spiral that has both symmetry and movement forward. Each generation dies, but not without leaving its imprint, passing something on for the next one to carry forward. Okay, so lesson number 5. Nothing remains the same because change is the essence of nature. And this lesson I learned from rocks and thinking in geologic time. In my attempt to find something rock solid to hold on to after experiencing so many losses in my family, I studied the geology of Maine, which led me down a rabbit hole in time where I discovered Pangea and other supercontinents previous to ours, and the current forces that continue to push our continents away from each other. So I took a walk with Scudic Acadia Park Ranger Kate Petrie, who, as I wrote in my book, stressed that Maine's landscape was shaped by a series of violent collisions and separations, the push and pull of a restless world, and it continues to be sculpted by forces deep inside the earth. Even today, there's stuff going on right under our feet, Kate said, her eyes glinting and a smile spreading across her face as if she was letting us in on a well-kept secret. So much for being rock solid, I thought. And I was initially disappointed. But then I realized that families too are restless. They're pushed apart by the expanding geography of competing needs. My brother Joe left for college when I was 11, and we never lived in the same place again. And except for the beginning of my life and the end of her life, my mother and I also lived apart, and we experienced the ultimate separation with her death. But I still expected my original family to be part of the landscape, especially Joe, who I assumed would accompany me into old age. You anticipate burying a parent, not a brother. When he died 3 years after my mom, my own personal Pangea disintegrated, sending me adrift like a continent in an unknown sea. But over the years, I got used to Joe being gone and came to appreciate veins of him running through his grown sons. Not just his eyes and nails, but his thoughtful, measured way of speaking, with which his older child makes any argument convincing, and his mechanical mindset that enabled his younger son to fix the espresso machine and realign our cabinet doors. Once the raw edges eroded from the gaping hole he left behind, I mentally collected these remnants of Joe to remind me that he's still here with us, although in a different form. Over time, the feelings they stirred became heartwarming rather than heartbreaking, along with all the memories, all those essential chips that comprise what he means to me. Similarly, though, initially I walked the landscape gingerly, devoid of my mom, careful to avoid any fragments left behind, I eventually sought them out, mixing old remembrances with the new, the good with the bad, until they formed a fully rounded conglomerate melded with understanding. We tend to think that what always has been will always be, the earth under our feet, the mountains in the distance, our parents and siblings no more than a phone call away. But permanence is an illusion. The restless nature of our earth leaves no geologic or family formation intact over time. You can't hold on to something moving away. Instead, you collect stones left behind, keepsakes of another era, remnants of a brother or mother, and balance them one on top of another like rocks laid upon a grave, cairns that mark both the journey and the final resting place, pebbles to remind you of what once was. Nothing stays the same, but something always remains. Um, this lesson, I think, has particular relevance to all of us living in Maine now that the Gulf of Maine is supposedly one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world. So there's concern that pretty soon the lobster is going to leave Maine and head for Canada's cooler waters, which will leave us devoid of a major industry in our state. And of course, many of us, due to climate change, have experienced major storms and coastal erosion and damage to our properties over the past few years. Um, and, you know, um, there's, I think there's some people who are concerned that our peninsula may be slowly drowning. Um, but rather than become overwhelmed and depressed about the changing weather we're experiencing, I try to recognize that nature is always evolving and changing, whether due to the increase of carbon dioxide caused by humans or by the increase of oxygen that happened billions of years ago when organisms first started photosynthesizing on Earth. This prompted a major die-off of those currently living creatures at the time who were not suited for the new atmosphere. Of course, we still need to make an effort to stem climate change, especially since we're the main perpetrators of it. But at the same time, we also need to expect and prepare for the major changes it's likely to cause in the near future. Again, as much as we'd like things to stay the same, nothing does in nature. And we need to prepare for that both psychologically and physically. So, for example, researchers and volunteers right here at the Skudik Institute recently planted over 1,000 tree saplings that they're monitoring to help predict which trees grow best in response to predicted changes in temperature and water conditions. The data that they gather in this study will inform their own forest management strategies in the park. And the Institute is also engaging local residents, including me, in numerous citizen science projects to monitor changes in wildlife on the peninsula. And there are a number of local efforts made by other entities, including the recently formed Gouldsboro Coastal Resilience Committee, to identify roads and other infrastructure most at risk in our area due to climate change and what steps to take to make things more resilient. Similarly, the majestic towering California sequoia stands are not likely to tolerate the changing climate conditions experts predict for their extremely limited habitat in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. So foresters have planted millions of sequoia seeds in new locations with varying climates, hopeful that they might survive if their ancestors, some of which are as old as 3,000 years, succumb to climate change. All right, lesson number 6. Having a greater awareness of death gives you a greater appreciation of life. And this was a lesson that is really about what the dying can teach the living. And it's one that I didn't fully appreciate until I wrote an essay called At Death's Door that was published in a literary magazine called Broad Street, which you can find online if you're interested in reading. Um, and I initially set out to explore in this essay why my 87-year-old father, who had deterioration of his body on multiple fronts, was so resistant to dying, yet my brother was so accepting of his imminent death at the age of 55. So I'll share with you a few excerpts from this so you can see what I mean about how the dying teach the living. At the end of his life, my brother didn't dwell on what he did or did not accomplish personally. Instead, as his world shrank due to his limited mobility, he focused outward on what he could experience at his home in the Vermont countryside. As he wrote in his blog, I go as slowly as I can, savoring the sights, the sounds, the smells of life around. While others rush, oblivious to their own ends, I choose day by day to linger while I can. Joe seemed to see things that the rest of us never noticed, or maybe we noticed but didn't savor. When first confined to a wheelchair, Joe said he was like someone on the observation deck of a cruise ship. He finally had the time to sit back and relish the view. I rarely had time to pause then, both my writing career and my young daughter requiring most of my time. Rushing to meet work and domestic deadlines, a part of me was jealous of the time he had to observe. He had time to see the goldfinches come and go, time to view fall and stop action fashion, one leaf set on fire after another, time to watch the snowflakes drift down from the sky and settle on his lawn, slowly knitting a soft white shroud that muffled sound. Joe's ability to do and experience things was shrinking by the dark rim of immobility, but it left him better able to focus and appreciate the view he still had, like the opening in a pinhole camera. Joe put it another way. I feel like I'm watching the sunset of my life, and the colors have never been so brilliant now that it's about to set. He spent hours watching the woods around him, rejoicing when he heard a returning Phoebe in spring, and laughing when he saw his dog pounce on mounds of snow. He was in pain and frustrated with his inability to move, but perhaps that prompted his mind to meld with the greater sphere that surrounded him. Maybe by the time he died, he was so practiced at going beyond himself that it didn't take that much to make that next leap off the ledge of life. He was ready, ready to say goodbye, ready to be embraced by death, ready to have his ashes spread under the stand of white birches he loved hiking to on the mountain that cast a shadow over his house. Annie Dillard suggests in her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek that the dying pray at the last, not please, but thank you, as a guest thanks his host at the door. But my father never even said goodbye. He gripped life with an unyielding tenacity at the end because he didn't feel like he had lived it fully, or maybe because he was afraid of what came next. In contrast, my brother welcomed the comfort death would bring him. After watching the birds at his feeder one last time and taking medicine to ease his transition, he went off his ventilator, stopped breathing, and quietly left this world, leaving me to wonder what we can learn from the dying. Those at the end of their time on earth do not show us what to do on our deathbeds, but what to do in our lives, to live fully, aware of what is around and beyond us, to appreciate each milestone, to savor each cup of coffee, but also to let go when the time comes, to not be afraid of death, but instead to welcome nature's embrace and being part of the elements again, to say thank you before opening death's door. Okay, only two more lessons. Lesson number 7, every ending is a beginning. Well, this sounds really simple, but it's not, because it requires you to let go of the past and look towards the future. And when you're in between the two, you're in this kind of interim state of wobbliness, like a toddler taking his first steps. And as I wrote in my book, when my mother and brother died, wiping off major segments of the family map, panic ensued, a feeling of being rudderless and not knowing where to turn next without the familiar landmarks of loved ones who had always been present. After tossing about, mourning one death in the family after another, like a kayak rocked by the wakes of other vessels passing, I came to Maine to discover a way out of this dark period. But maybe that way requires getting lost. Didn't explorers have to get lost in order to find someplace new? Perhaps we all feel the pull of the familiar and family, both words sharing the same domestic root, the same urge to nestle in our nest of origin. But when the death of your family uproots you, can it also be freeing, an opportunity to see the shape you assume when not molded by others? As Bernd Heinrich states in his book, what better opportunity than death, not to sanctify an end, but to celebrate a new beginning? And as I wrote in the epilogue of my book, she squeals, she squirms, and she waves her arms above her, conducting an orchestra no one can see, all the while bouncing on her legs against the high chair and practicing her consonants ba and da with glee. She's a bundle of energy with a grin for everyone who greets her. We shuffle in for breakfast, silent and somnolent, until we drink our morning coffee, slow to warm up to another day with so many days behind us the same. But not Jo. She's new to this world, and everything in the world is new to her. She whips her head in response to the sound of the coffee grinder, bunches up her brightly colored bib, bringing it to her mouth to explore further, and tracks the squirrel outside the window as it bounds across the lawn. She swivels both her body and her attention from one thing to another, not wanting to miss out, her enthusiasm contagious, her energy relentless, her zest for life delightful. If she had words in her mind, there would be nonstop excited chatter. A bird, grandma, flowers, bacon sizzling, a squirrel, flowers, grandma. She's a granddaughter my brother will never meet, the great grandchild my parents will never hold, the first of a fresh new generation eager to make the acquaintance of everything. The healing mascot for our family, Jo answers the ultimate question: why is there a decline in death followed by birth and life? That answer surfaces when I see her unblemished by experience, her eyes sparkling with excitement, her body pulsating with life's heartbeat, her entire being ready to explore. The answer is to refresh the wonder. So, because I didn't have an appropriate photo of my grand niece, Jo, I snuck in this photo of my granddaughter, Cora, because never miss the opportunity to share photos of the grandchildren, right? Okay, now speaking of refreshing the wonder, what could be more wonder-inducing and restorative than the beautiful scenery that we have here on the Scudic Peninsula? And it's our stunning scenery that inspired my photo book, Wild and Wondrous, Nature's Artistry on the Coast of Maine. Because every time we came back from Maine to winter in Philadelphia, what I missed most were those astonishing Maine moments of natural beauty, like this ephemeral glinting spotlight of sun on the bay, or morning dew anointing each pine needle with sparkling pendants of water, or what I call a fog aura. So these unexpected encounters in nature I found disrupted my normal frame of reference, restoring a childlike sense of wonder about the world. And wanting to capture these fleeting but meaningful times, I started carrying my camera with me wherever I went in Maine, and I snapped away. And although I began my photographic career more than 30 years earlier with all sorts of bulky camera equipment and a darkroom, I switched to solely using the iPhone camera and its phone editing software in 2016, as I found the best camera to have for nature photography is one that you have in your back pocket at all times and can quickly whip out to take pictures of those wonderful fleeting moments like this, or this, or this shot of the Goldsboro Bay, or this shot of the Grand Marsh Bay. So nearly all the photos in Wild and Wondrous were taken with my iPhone camera, although a few were taken with a point and shoot camera. And I found in taking all those photos that there is wonder to be found in both nature's expansive landscapes and in her miniature features, like these dog whelk eggs next to barnacles on a rock, or in insects so tiny I didn't even realize their amazing features until I magnified them in the photo editing process. So to give you an idea of scale, that dance fly that you see on the middle on a petal of an oxeye daisy has golden slippers made of pollen grains. So Wild and Wondrous is the end result of my attempts to encapsulate the ephemeral, to imprint on paper impressions of something much more profound. Nature is the ultimate artist, and I am merely a scribe trying to record her beauty and share her wonders. Now, let's sample some of those atmospheric, geologic, and wildlife wonders that we have up here in Maine. So because it's so far north, Maine has what Emily Dickinson would say a certain slant of light that when you mix it with fog and other atmospherics, gives kind of an ethereal quality to the landscape, as you can see here with the beams of light stretching through the clouds that are sparkling just a small portion of the bay, or the morning sun setting the whole um, uh, fog ablaze. Where the low angled beams in the early morning or late afternoon hours can transform a fern leaf or jellyfish into something much more luminous and cast a divine glow on everything in their midst. I took this photo, I think, right after sunrise. And a foggy day in Maine can also be inspiring as it reveals more by showing less. By highlighting what's in the foreground, as it does in this picture, it makes you notice what you may not have otherwise. Fog also imparts a dreaminess to the landscape that can make you question what's there and what isn't, and what is real and what is a mirage. And it often eliminates the touchstone of our existence, which is the horizon line, and that creates a confusing new reality as well as can highlight certain aspects. And here you see the conical forms of the trees emerging from the fog, making it look like they're floating in midair. And fog that wreathes the islands always gives it them a more magical, mystical quality, I think. And fog also can decorate the vegetation with sequins of water that glitter when the sun comes out later, and transform the quotidian into something much more sublime. Winter snowfalls and ice are other atmospherics that can induce wonder with the awe-inspiring beauty that they engrave in frozen water. So on the picture on the left, you see how the ice solidified the dance of the sea into frozen fragments that landed on the grass of the edge of the shore. Whereas on the photo in the right, ice showcases stream bubbles that got caught inside it. And here you see snow's crystalline magic outlining every branch of this conifer tree in white, and providing a nice white backdrop that highlights features of the forest floor that maybe you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And of course, ice and snow can reveal the tracks of others still active in winter. So on the right, you see the imprints of a raccoon's paws. In the middle are the labyrinthine trails that the mice make through the snow in winter. And then as the snow starts to melt, you start to see them emerge. And on the bottom left is a porcupine uh, imprint of his, tail swishing behind him in the snow. And of course, on the upper right is a human making tracks at Shark Cove Pond in Korea. So moving on to the geologic-based wonders we have here, striking geologic features of coastal Maine include the many mountains. And if you're lucky to be able to summit them, I love how they give you just a total change of perspective. I like to say that being on top of a mountain is like being on top of the world. And that can also be awe-inspiring. And Maine also has more than 2,000 islands that often magically appear and disappear with the tides. So on our own Korea Beach, we have this land bridge that forms at low tide, and it usually only lasts about an hour. But if you're able to make it across to the island, it's like entering another planet, because it has these huge boulders. Some of them remind me of beached whales. And most of lots of cobbles, and most of the island is devoid of vegetation. And of course, another major feature of Maine is its many bodies of water that were really parting gifts from the glacier that shaped our U-shaped bays and formed bogs and lakes and ponds that are so reflective. And these reflections kind of give you pause and prompt you to observe things more closely. This one was taken on a kayak ride out of Bass Harbor on MDI. Reflections can be wonderfully discombobulating, like these trees extending uh, into water, or what I call sky plants on the right, or two suns. These tricks of light stimulate the mind as you try to make sense of what the ordinary has turned extraordinary, and it can stir a profound sense of amazement. So I'm going to leave you with one example of wonder in nature that you can see right in this area, and was one I discovered when we were here one April, when there was still patches of snow on the ground. And so Frank and I bundled up and we went for a walk in our development. And all along the side of the road were these ditches that had filled with water. And we heard a sound that we thought was a frog. So we went over to one of these pools of water. We looked inside, and this is what we saw, which I didn't even know what it was. I had to go online to do some research to figure it out. But it turns out that what we had seen was a yellow spotted salamander. And I was thrilled because you rarely get to glimpse these nocturnal amphibians because they're normally hiding in the forest underneath leaf litter or in burrows. So why was a reclusive nocturnal landlubber swimming in a roadside ditch in broad daylight? Well, I discovered that in March or April, snow melt and spring downpours leave behind transient bodies of water called vernal pools. And on the first warm and rainy night, what biologists affectionately call the big night, these animals stream out of the forest and make a long trek until they splash into these pools of water where they're born. Given their small size, this is an epic journey comparable to the thousands of miles traveled by the African wildebeest in the Serengeti every year. And this journey is quite dangerous. I mean, think about it. These are soft, squishy animals with very few ways of protecting themselves from much bigger predators, let alone cars speeding by. So each step of the way is filled with peril, and many fail to reach their aquatic destinations. So, what is compelling these shy, earthbound creatures, critters preferring to hide in a bed of soil with a heavy blanket of rock or molding vegetation, to willfully expose themselves, endanger their lives, and travel all that way so that they can enter a fluid realm for which they're no longer suited? Sex, of course. So hordes of salamanders roil these temporary waters with their mating rain dances and orgies that outdo the renowned bacchanal gatherings of ancient Romans. During these nighttime nuptials, males squirt out packets of their sperm, which sink to the bottom of the oversized puddles. Females then dive into the water and sashay their rear ends over the sperm packets to take in the seminal fluid into their egg-filled orifices. Soon after the sperm fertilizes her eggs, the spotted salamander deposits them, forming a gelatinous green blob attached to brush in the water. So close to probably 100 developing embryos fill each of these blobs, which are actually only about 3 or 4 inches wide. And algae impregnating these cells give these blobs their bright chartreuse color, and they help the embryos inside them breathe and grow. And in return, the embryo's waste products feed the algae. So this makes the spotted salamander, at least in this stage of its life, the only known vertebrate to reap sustenance from the sun like the plants. Isn't that astonishing? A photosynthesizing animal? I just love that. You can usually see these telltale green blobs of spotted salamander eggs in the vernal pools near us, but despite persistent seeking, I never saw the salamander larva that hatched from the eggs there. And then one time when we biked to Scooter Point with our friends Amy and Linda, while they were out rambling on the rocks, I stayed behind to take pictures of the pools of water at the far end, the farthest end away from the water. So they were freshwater pools. And look what I discovered when I looked carefully into them. The larva of spotted salamanders. and their tiny bodies easily blend in, because of the way they're colored with water darkened by leaf tannins. So that's probably why I never saw them near us. And I've been looking for them for more than a decade. So of course I was really excited to see them, and I couldn't stop taking pictures. And then someone from behind me, who I thought was my friend Amy, asked me what I saw, and I said, salamander larva. And when I got no response, I looked over my shoulder and I realized it wasn't Amy at all. It was some stranger who was kind of shaking her head like, what's this crazy lady so excited about spotted salamanders larva? But they really gave me another shot of wonder with their heads surrounded by feathery gray gills like a boa. These gills help them breathe, and the pools act like a communal womb in which they transform from an aqueous to a terrestrial creature. And after a month or so in these pools, they swap their gills for lungs, their fins disappear, their eyes develop lids, and their tails, skin, and limbs thicken just in time for them to walk out of the shallow water before it dries up in the summer heat. Some may not make this primeval transition to land because they haven't completely metamorphosized when the vernal pools disappear. But why not just have sex in the forest where they reside most of their lives and lay their eggs in lakes or ponds there, I wondered. Well, it turns out that because the vernal pools are shallow and temporary, no predatory fish live live in them. So that makes them relatively safe place for the salamander eggs and their hatched larvae to develop. And this appears to be the main driver propelling spotted salamanders to scamper in synchrony out of the forest and return to their lowland natal pools. Now, isn't that amazing? Okay, so I've just given you a taste of both my More Than Meets the Eye memoir and my Wild and Wondrous photo book, both of which the Scudic Institute will be selling, and I'll be happy to sign tonight in the lobby. And also in the lobby, you can see my photo exhibit, in which I feature one photo from each of my book's 10 chapters that depict a different prominent aspect of Maine. And as Rachel Carson once asked her readers to do, I ask of you, drink in the beauty and think and wonder of the meaning of what you see. And if you'd like to see more of my writings or photos, please go to my website or follow me on Instagram or Facebook. And now I welcome your thoughts and questions. So just raise your hand if you want to say something. Oh, we got somebody over there.
Looking at the picture of your granddaughter, I guess it was,
Yeah.
reminded me of my grandson, who's 22 months old. But listening to your words, I began to realize, okay, when you're a little kid like that, grandma flowers, grandma butterfly, you've got lantern consciousness. You don't focus on anything for more than an instant, but
Yeah.
you're in absolute awe of the diversity of what life presents. And you contrasted that with what was going on with your brother as he became more, in my reading of it, more focused on what was important and meaningful and the blessings of life that he had had.
Right.
And that to me is the transition, the life transition that hopefully we all make from this absolute wonder at everything that's there, but we can't focus on anything. And we slowly begin to find what the meaning is so that at the end, we're crystallized around what has been most important to us.
Oh.
So that was a fun insight to have.
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us. That's very nice. Anybody else?
I have a question. Margie over here, Susie. Thank you for sharing this. Your photos are really beautiful. And so it was making me think about if you could share a little bit about your process for when you are taking images. Is it just right place, right time? Or do you look outside and say, oh, it looks like it's getting interesting out there? Just share a little bit about what you're doing when you're taking these photos.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I have what I call a photography on the fly process, which means that like I mentioned, I carry a camera with me wherever I go, my iPhone camera. And whenever something catches my eye, I just quickly whip it out and take a zillion pictures from different angles and using different lenses. And then I winnow out the best ones much later when I'm, going through them. So I actually spent most of my photography time deleting photos. But I also, I think part of my process is being kind of quick on the draw. So I have one picture in my book of myself in a bathrobe taking pictures of the sun interacting with the fog as it was starting to rise because I didn't want to take the time to get dressed. And I have a very patient husband who's part of my photographic process because he's always waiting for me to take photos when we're on the trails together. Does that help explain it? You have a question over here?
I was struck by the wondrous pictures of clouds that you took.
Yeah.
I think they are extraordinary. And have you heard of the Cloud Appreciation
Yes, I
Society?
remember.
You remember? Okay.
It's him speak, the guy who started it. He spoke at the Scudic Institute several years ago, and he was marvelous.
No,
Yeah. His book is great too.
I recently discovered them and joined, and I think there's only 80,000 members worldwide.
Yeah.
But I'm convinced that many of your cloud pictures could easily make cloud of the day.
Yeah, thank you. I always forget to upload them, but yeah, they're amazing, those clouds. Any other questions or comments? Oh, here we have one.
Margie, I just want to say thank you. Your work has touched me deeply.
It's
It
nice to
just,
hear.
I don't even have words to describe it. I was introduced to you maybe 6 months ago via Zoom, north of Boston, and a library event. And it's just such a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you. I do have a question regarding taking the photos with your iPhone, but you just referred to different lenses. So is that an app that you use?
No, most people's iPhones come with 2 or 3 lenses. So there's the standard 1x lens, which is a somewhat of a wide angle lens. Then you might have a 0.5x, which is an extra wide angle lens, and then either a 2x, a 3x, or a 5x, which is more of a telephoto lens. And so, but you can use that telephoto lens to take close-ups of uh, insects or other things that are small. So I may start, with a bigger picture, but then I may zero in on one particular thing with a different, by switch. And all you do to switch the lenses, you just, press your finger on it. And also I'll stoop low to the ground in a landscape, or I'll stand up and I'll, look at it from a different perspective. So I usually take a bunch of different shots. And does that answer your question? And thank you for your comments. That was very kind.
We're going to go to Zoom for a question from Sarah Carlson. She asks, do you ever write about something, especially spiritually, and then see a natural scene that fits what you wrote? Or do you often take photos and then write?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Um, I I I think it's more that, like Rachel Carson says, I look at something, I take a photo about it, I think about it, and that's when I find the spiritual insights. And so, for example, I have an exhibit right now at the main Jewish museum in Portland that's called Wild and Wondrous: Seeking the Divine in Nature, that intersperses information that I have written on the wall about Jewish principles and practices that are designed to inspire awe with my photos from nature, because I saw the parallels that I was experiencing this awe in nature that other people were experiencing when they prayed or they followed various Jewish precepts. So That was kind of a fun experience for me to intertwine the two and explore, because I think there's a sort of universal nature to spirituality, which is I view as anything that takes you beyond yourself.
All right. Well, I want to one more time, all join me in thanking Margie.
Thank you very much.
So, and as you are all taking photos out there in nature, plants and animals, fungi, and other kingdoms, we do encourage you to add those to iNaturalist as observations to help scientists understand the changing world out there. Just here in Acadia, there have been over 600,000 citizen science observations. So thanks to all of you for being part of our community of science. You have over 1,000. Ah, very good, very good. So just a couple quick announcements before you are all released for the evening. So one, again, big thanks to Margie and for your thoughts, your experiences, really sharing your beautiful prose and connections with nature and life and death. And your 2 books are on sale here. So I do encourage you to grab a copy on your way out, More Than Meets the Eye and Wild and Wondrous. Okay, and then for upcoming events, please check out our calendar page on our website. There's lots happening. Every Wednesday, you can be a soil hero. If you're wondering what a soil hero is, check out our calendar page. If you are interested in helping restoring ecosystems in Acadia and you like hiking to summits, or someone you know does, you may be a good candidate to become a soil hero and help with the active restorations happening in the park every Wednesday. Other upcoming events, we have the Maine Outdoor Film Festival on August 22nd. We have some astronomy programs that are kicking up soon. Those are a sign definitely of the changing season, meaning that nightfall is coming a little earlier in the evening. And also we have our fall bird tours starting here at the end of this month. I'm not ready for summer to be over, but it's not up to me. And the birds listen to nature and are already on the move for the fall. And lastly, we have our September lecture upcoming up on the screen here. You can see Dr. Suzanne Greenlaw, and the talk is going to be lessons from co-production research. Dr. Suzanne Greenlaw is a citizen of the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians. She is an indigenous ecologist, a writer, and a traditional harvester. She is a really amazing scientist. She's a postdoctoral scientist here with Schoodic Institute and doing some really amazing research and work here in Acadia related to traditional harvesting of plants. So I do encourage you to come for that lecture on September 10th. All right, so with that, thank you all for coming tonight, participating, and have a wonderful evening.